Hey there, and welcome back to our Read Through the Bible in a Year series. Well, here we are, week number 7, day number 2, in Numbers chapters 25 through 29. Today I'm definitely going to do things a little out of order because I want to group it together kind of by theme. The first thing I want to do is just a couple of things that stand independent of each other that I want to point out in our reading today. So we see here, just let's get the context there. The Israelites, they're camped out on the edge of the Promised Land. Soon they're going to be finally going in to the Promised Land. And we've come to the point now where, remember back earlier in Numbers that God had told the people, since they refused to earlier go into the Promised Land, God had told them that none of that generation that was 20 and older, that was counted in the first census, none of them would be allowed to go into the Promised Land as a consequence for their sin. It would be their children, the next generations that would come in. And so we've been wandering in the desert. We've been wandering for 40 years now. They're at the edge of the Promised Land. That generation has died off, and so God calls for another census to be taken. A census to be taken to see, who is this new generation? Let's count this new generation that is 20 years and older, the ones that are going to be allowed to enter the Promised Land. And a couple things I want to point out in these numbers that are counted. First one is the huge decline in the tribe of Simeon. They are 37,000 less than they were. We see most of the other tribes, there's not a lot of changes. There are some nice increases, but there's no decrease that comes anywhere near this. And in just a minute on our video, we're going to talk about some specific sin that a leader of the tribe of Simeon was involved in. And so I just want to, right at this point, say that might really relate to why their numbers are so much lower, is that their tribe was really a big part of this sin that we're going to talk about in a minute, that you've already read about, with taking up with the foreign wives and following in the worship of their false gods. But it seems that the tribe of Simeon must have really been involved in this heavily, because they seem to have really taken a large hit as a consequence of their sin. But the number I really want to focus on is the total number. You'll notice the total number is pretty much the same, a little over 600,000. Pretty much the same as the census was, 40 years earlier when it was taken. And this is a number of worship. Because this reminds us that God, He cared for His people as they wandered in the wilderness. They wandered for 40 years, just, drinking water and eating manna. And it could be very easy to see that, they might have lost a lot of numbers in this time as they were wandering, going around, but that's not the case at all. God provided for this entire community as they were traveling around. God's power, God's love, God's care, God's plan. And pretty much the same exact numbers that started all this wandering, even though it's a new generation now, they're pretty much going into the Promised Land with those same numbers. So just a number of worship as we reflect on God providing for His people. Another little separate thing that I want to just highlight here is, and I'll probably never say this right, but Zelophehad's daughters. These are the daughters that came and said, our father has no sons, and because of that, he's going to lose his inheritance, he's going to lose his land, and we think it should be passed on to us. And Moses goes and he talks to God about it, and God says, yes, that is right. That land should go to the daughters in this case. And I only point this out because, sometimes people want to portray the Bible as putting women, reflecting poorly on women, and putting women down, and putting women, in a place, that it shouldn't be done, almost as if the Bible is anti-woman, or God is anti-woman in some sense. And I've heard that from lots of people. And whenever I speak with people that say that, I try to point out all the places in the Bible where women are just held up very highly, and God's taking care of women, and God loving, women just as He loves men, because they're both created in His image. And here is a perfect example of that, where God says, yes, in this case, the daughters, they inherit the land, they claim it. So just want to point that out as an interesting aside as to kind of counter the argument that some people make about God's and the Bible stance and view of women. One other kind of independent thought for today is Moses. Once again, we want to just kind of look at Moses and see his character and his humility. God has told Moses, you're not going to get to go into the promised land because of what you did. And Moses could complain, and he could say, but God, what about all these times I served perfectly, and what about this, and what about that? But he doesn't. His response to God is he cares so much about the community of people that he wants to make sure that there's a leader that's raised up to replace him, to be the shepherd to the people. So instead of thinking about himself and complaining that he doesn't get to enter the promised land after all he's done, he accepts God's the consequences God has laid out for him, and he cares so much about the community that that's where his focus is. So it's just a beautiful picture. It's something we can learn from, just caring about others more than caring about ourselves. All right, so the final thing I want to talk about today is kind of mixing in two different things we read today and jumping back to the beginning. We see this tragedy, if you will, that happens throughout their wanderings from the time they left Egypt till this point. You may remember in the previous videos I've said to follow the grumble. We've seen the Israelite people grumble about not having the food they wanted, not having enough water, wanting to go back to Egypt, complaining against the leadership, not going into the promised land the first time around because they were scared. And here we come to a point where all of this grumbling and rebellion, if you will, it finally culminates in what they do as they are camped out on the plains of Moab. And the Bible tells us, and I just read what it says in 25. It says, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods. So Israelite joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. They finally come to the point now where they are turning away from the worship of the one true God, and they are worshiping false gods, pagan gods. So it's quite an image here as they're camped out waiting to go into the land that God has promised them, this beautiful thing that He has done for them, and they turn their backs on God, and they become involved. They become involved in the worship of other gods. And so I think as we look at this, what it made me think about was this: that even as God was remaining faithful to His covenant promises, the Israelites were breaking their faithfulness. And I say that because this comes right after what just happened with Balaam, and Balaam and Balak the king was trying to put a curse on the Israelite people, but God was remaining faithful to His covenant promises that He would bless His people. And so we've had this great picture of God being faithful and not allowing His people to be cursed by Balaam. At the same time, in the same moment, the people, they're not remaining faithful to God. They're turning from God. So in our lives, it's never a matter of God staying true, of God staying faithful. It's always a question of, will we stay faithful? Will we, daily stay faithful and obedient to God, as He is always faithful to us. And so as we think about that, and we think about in this reading today, there was kind of a review of the sacrifices the people were to make that had already been mentioned in the book of Leviticus. And what jumped out at me was that as these sacrifices were being reviewed, and these were not like the free will offerings that we looked at the beginning of Leviticus, the things that people on their voluntarily brought. These were the sacrifices that the people, as a community of people, were required to make at the different feasts, the Feast of Trumpets, at the Passover, at the Feast of Weeks, Feast of Tabernacles, the Day of Atonement, monthly offerings, Sabbath offerings, and then even daily offerings. The 2 daily offerings they were required to give. all of these were to be burnt offerings. And so all of these were to be total offerings. And none of the food from these offerings was to be eaten by the priest or the people. They were total offerings. And as we look at this picture of how the Israelite people broke their faithfulness with God, and how they turned to this pagan worship as they were, seduced by the Moabite and the Midianite women that lived around them. These offerings to me kind of speak towards that. That we need to be, they needed to be reminded that they were to be totally dedicated to God. And that's what the burnt offerings were all about. If you remember from our previous teaching, the burnt offerings were a sign of total surrender, total dedication to God. And some of these burnt offerings were to be daily offerings. So it was a daily reminder. They were to be reminded every single day as a community of people, when these daily burnt offerings were to be made. They were to be reminded as a community of people, every day we must remain totally dedicated to God. Every day we must remain totally surrendered to God. Every day we must remain totally faithful to God. And they had not done this. They had not done this in a huge way as they turned to the false gods. And so it's just a reminder, as same reminder that was on our video from the previous day, a reminder to us that we need to daily be totally surrendered to God, and daily be totally dedicated to God, and daily be just totally faithful to God. Now we can only do this, of course, with God's help and the strength of God, and relying totally on Him to help keep us totally faithful to Him. So today, may we be people who remember that God is always faithful, that all of God's promises are true, that God never lies, that God never lets us down. And may we be encouraged to be people who are faithful, who are totally dedicated and totally surrendered daily to our God. Y'all have a great day, and I will talk to you next time.